Buddhism first set foot on the shores of Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE, marking the beginning of a deep and enduring connection that would shape the island's destiny for centuries to come. The story of how this ancient spiritual tradition arrived in Sri Lanka, endured challenges, and ultimately thrived is nothing short of remarkable. Sri Lanka, a land steeped in its own ancient cultures, had long been home to local tribes like the Yakshas and Nagas, who practiced a blend of indigenous religions. But this would change when Prince Vijaya and his 700 followers from the Kalinga region of India set sail to the island, arriving in the 5th century BCE, during a time when the island was still under the rule of tribal chieftains. Prince Vijaya's journey was not a mere accident of history. He was banished from his homeland in India after a series of political conflicts and found his way to Sri Lanka on the very same day that the Buddha entered parinirvana, the state of final passing away. His arrival on the island, therefore, coincided with a cosmic moment, an event of profound significance for the unfolding story of Buddhism. Upon setting foot on Sri Lankan soil, Vijaya, who hailed from the eastern Indian kingdom of Sinhapura, quickly established his rule by marrying a local tribal princess named Kavini. However, his reign was not to last in peace. After abandoning his first wife and children, Vijaya married a princess from the powerful kingdom of Mathura in northern India. This marriage solidified his rule and marked the beginning of the Sinhala royal lineage. But it was not only the throne that was at stake during this time. It was the future of the island's spiritual landscape. While Hinduism, Jainism, and various indigenous beliefs dominated the early Sri Lankan religious scene, the winds of change were already blowing from the Indian subcontinent. The rise of Buddhism in India, particularly during the reign of Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya dynasty, set the stage for a transformative chapter in Sri Lanka's religious history. As Buddhism began to spread across the Indian subcontinent, King Ashoka, one of the most influential figures in Indian history, was deeply moved by the violence and bloodshed of the Kalinga War. This war, in which over 100,000 were killed and countless others were taken captive, became the turning point for Ashoka, who then embraced Buddhism with an unwavering dedication to peace and dharma. In the year 268 BCE, King Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism became a key moment not only for India but for the wider Buddhist world. Driven by his newfound faith, Ashoka sought to spread Buddhism far beyond India's borders. His mission to spread the Dharma was not confined to his own empire. Instead, he turned his attention to the neighboring kingdoms, and Sri Lanka, with its rich cultural heritage, was next in line. In 250 BCE, under the leadership of Ashoka's son, Mahinda, a mission was sent to Sri Lanka to bring the teachings of the Buddha to the island. Mahinda, then 32 years old, set sail from India with a group of monks to a land that had never heard the Buddha's teachings. On the day of their arrival, the island's ruler, King Devanampiyatissa Tissa of Anuradhapura, was out on a hunting expedition with his entourage. It was during this hunt that he encountered Mahinda and his group of monks, dressed in the distinctive yellow robes of the Buddhist order. Struck by their peaceful demeanor and intrigued by their message, the king approached Mahinda, who offered him a discourse on the Dharma. The king, deeply moved by Mahinda's teachings, was the first of many to be converted. The next day, at Mahinda's invitation, the king welcomed the monks to the capital city of Anuradhapura, where they preached to the people. The king, eager to support the spread of Buddhism, gifted the monks the royal park, which was later transformed into the first Buddhist monastery on the island, the Mahavihara. This marked the official establishment of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. The arrival of Buddhism was not only a political event but a deeply cultural one. The island's first stupa, the Tuparama, was built to enshrine a relic of the Buddha, his collarbone, further cementing the importance of Buddhism in the cultural and spiritual life of the island. But the influence of Buddhism did not stop at the royal court. Mahinda's teachings reached the hearts of the common people, and soon, many men and women joined the monastic order, embracing the life of monks and nuns. The transformation was rapid, as Buddhism spread across the island, making its mark in every corner of the land. Yet, it was not only the teachings that Mahinda brought with him. He also carried with him a sacred gift from his father, King Ashoka, a sapling of the very Bodhi tree under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment. This sacred tree was planted in Anuradhapura, where it still stands today as a living symbol of Sri Lanka's deep connection to the Buddhist tradition. The Bodhi tree of Anuradhapura, now over 2 millennia old, is regarded as the oldest historically documented tree in the world. The tree has become a pilgrimage site for millions of Buddhists worldwide, a tangible connection to the Buddha's enlightenment, and a symbol of the enduring power of the Dharma. Buddhism continued to flourish in Sri Lanka throughout the centuries, supported by successive kings who patronized the monastic orders and helped build temples, stupas, and monasteries across the island. But the path of Buddhism in Sri Lanka was not always smooth. The island faced numerous challenges, from invasions by foreign powers to internal conflicts and periods of religious persecution. In the face of these challenges, Buddhism showed remarkable resilience. During some of the darkest times, when foreign invaders sought to suppress the religion, many Buddhist monks were killed and monasteries were destroyed. The very survival of Buddhism in Sri Lanka seemed to hang by a thread. In some instances, the persecution was so intense that only a handful of monks remained on the island, and Sri Lanka had to rely on the support of neighboring Buddhist countries, like Thailand and Myanmar, to keep the flame of Buddhism alive. Despite these difficulties, Buddhism in Sri Lanka endured. The teachings of the Buddha had taken such deep root that even in the face of adversity, they could not be extinguished. The monastic orders continued to thrive, and the sacred relics, the temples, and the teachings themselves provided a constant reminder of the resilience of the Buddhist spirit. For centuries, the teachings of Buddhism in Sri Lanka were passed down orally. The sacred scriptures, the Pali Canon, were memorized, recited, and preserved through the dedication of countless monks. But this practice was not without its risks. It took a catastrophic event for the Pali Canon to finally be committed to written form. In 103 BCE, during the reign of King Veda Gamini Ubya, disaster struck. A rebellion by a Brahmin named Thesa from the southern part of the island shook the kingdom to its core. Seizing the opportunity, a Tamil army from southern India invaded Sri Lanka, crushing the Lankans and forcing the king into exile for 14 long years. This was one of the most devastating periods in Sri Lanka's history. The island was struck by a terrible famine, and thousands of lives were lost. Buddhist monasteries, including the Mahavihara in Anuradhapura, were abandoned. Over 20,000 monks perished, either starving to death in the forests or dying in the neglected monasteries. Many monks fled to India, seeking refuge from the calamity. The famine, combined with the loss of so many ordained monks, sparked an overwhelming fear that the teachings of Buddhism in Sri Lanka might be lost forever. Only a few monks, those who could still recite the scriptures from memory, survived the catastrophe. It was only after 14 years that King Veda Gamini Ubya was able to reclaim his throne. One of his first actions was to address the crisis facing Buddhism. He targeted the rival Naganta sect, which had mocked him while he was in exile, and demolished their monasteries. But more importantly, the king realized that the oral transmission of the Buddhist scriptures was in danger of being lost. In an urgent bid to preserve the teachings, the king summoned the monks to gather at the Mahavihara in Anuradhapura. Here, a momentous convocation of monks was held, during which the entire body of Buddhist scriptures was carefully recited and transcribed onto palm leaves. This was the moment when the Tripitaka, the collection of the Vinaya, Sutta, and Abhidhamma, was formally committed to written form. The task was monumental. 500 monks worked tirelessly to write the teachings, ensuring that the scriptures would survive for future generations. The effort was an act of preservation, an answer to the chaos that had threatened to erase Buddhism from the island. The works didn't end there. Buddhaghosa, an Indian monk, arrived in Sri Lanka in the 5th century CE and began writing the famous Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification, a commentary on the Pali Canon. His insights helped clarify and preserve the teachings, offering detailed guidance on meditation, ethics, and wisdom. His writings became central to the Theravada tradition, which remains influential to this day. Alongside Buddhaghosa's works, the Dipavamsa, the Chronicle of the Island, and the Mahavamsa, the Great Chronicle, were written. These chronicles, penned between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, chronicled the history of Sri Lanka, documenting the arrival of Buddhism, the rise and fall of kings, and the long struggle to preserve the Dharma. But even as Buddhism was solidified in the island's culture, challenges persisted. The next few centuries were marked by a series of invasions, particularly from the Chola and Pandya kingdoms of southern India. These waves of aggression, although they did not entirely disrupt Buddhist practices, threatened to destabilize the fragile peace of Sri Lanka. In 1070 CE, King Vijayabahu I emerged as a savior. He successfully defeated the Cholas and reclaimed the island. He made Polonnaruwa his capital and oversaw a revival of Buddhist culture, including the restoration of temples, stupas, and monasteries that had been damaged during the conflicts. This was a time of revival and consolidation for Buddhism in Sri Lanka, but the most serious threat to the faith was yet to come. By the early 16th century, Sri Lanka found itself under the shadow of European colonization. The arrival of the Portuguese in 1505 marked the beginning of an era of brutal suppression of Buddhist practices. The Portuguese were not only interested in conquering land, but also in spreading Christianity by any means necessary. Their intolerance for Buddhism led to the destruction of many Buddhist institutions. The Portuguese sought to convert the island's population, offering rewards and privileges to those who accepted Christianity. Those who refused were subjected to horrific punishments. Many were thrown into pits filled with crocodiles or tortured in unimaginably cruel ways. Buddhist monks were especially targeted, with the punishment for wearing the yellow robes being death. Monasteries were looted and burned, and vast collections of Buddhist manuscripts were destroyed in the flames. By the time the Portuguese were expelled from Sri Lanka in 1658, only 5 ordained monks remained on the island. The island had almost lost its Buddhist identity altogether. Yet even in the darkest times, there were rays of hope. A king named Dharmapala, the grandson of King Bhuvanakabahu VI, had been converted to Christianity, but he soon began to regret his decision. He was the first Christian Sinhala king, but even he realized the importance of restoring Buddhism to Sri Lanka. However, it wasn't until the arrival of King Vimla Dharmasurya I in 1592 that any significant restoration began. Vimla Dharmasurya, after being educated in Portuguese-controlled Goa and baptized into Christianity, experienced a spiritual awakening. He realized that for Sri Lanka to regain its identity and sovereignty, it had to restore its Buddhist heritage. With great resolve, he began a campaign to revive Buddhism on the island. He discovered that there was not a single ordained monk left in Sri Lanka, and so he sent an urgent request to the King of Myanmar for help. In 1597, a group of monks from Myanmar arrived, bringing with them the sacred knowledge needed to re-establish the ordination process. This was a critical moment in the survival of Buddhism on the island. However, the Portuguese were not the only colonial force to threaten Buddhism in Sri Lanka. In the 17th century, the Dutch replaced the Portuguese as the colonial rulers. The Dutch, though less aggressive than the Portuguese, still had no love for Buddhism and continued the colonial policies of suppression. Yet during this time, Sri Lanka's Buddhist culture began to hold its ground. This period marked the darkest chapter in Sri Lanka's Buddhist history. Amidst this chaos, Kundana, a brilliant Buddhist monk, emerged as a beacon of hope. Having been educated in Christian schools, he was well-versed in both Christian and Buddhist scriptures. With his knowledge and wisdom, he boldly took up the challenge to confront the Christian missionaries in open debates. The missionaries, confident in their own intellectual superiority, eagerly accepted the challenge. But when the debates were over, it was the Buddhist monk who had emerged victorious, stunning the Christian clergy. This success became more than just a personal triumph. It sparked a wave of public interest in Buddhism. The 1873 debate at Panadora, in particular, captured significant attention. The Ceylon Times reported on it extensively, and the news spread like wildfire across Sri Lanka. The victory of Kundana against the missionaries began to turn the tide in favor of Buddhism once again. It wasn't long before the success of these debates reached the ears of a man who would become pivotal to Buddhism's revival in Sri Lanka. Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, an American lawyer, became intrigued by what he heard about the debates. In 1880, he arrived in Sri Lanka with the intent to study Buddhism and gain deeper knowledge of the island's rich spiritual heritage. He eventually converted to Buddhism and dedicated himself to revitalizing the faith. Olcott's work was transformative. He crisscrossed the island, organizing Buddhist schools and establishing educational institutions that promoted the teachings of the Buddha. His travels were not just about spreading knowledge. They were about restoring Buddhism to its rightful place in Sri Lankan society. Alcott's fervent work began to breathe new life into the flagging faith. Alongside Alcott, another key figure emerged, Anagarika Dharmapala. Born into a Christian family, Dharmapala underwent his own spiritual awakening and converted to Buddhism. He worked closely with Alcott, sharing his vision of a Buddhist revival in Sri Lanka. But Dharmapala's efforts weren't confined to Sri Lanka alone. He also made major contributions to the revival of Buddhism in India. One of his most important achievements was the founding of the Mahabodhi Society in Bodh Gaya, India. This society was established to restore the sacred Bodh Gaya temple, the site where the Buddha attained enlightenment. Dharmapala was determined to restore the Buddhist heritage not just in Sri Lanka but across South Asia. His vision was clear: to reignite the flame of Buddhism that had been smothered for centuries by foreign invaders and colonial forces. Even after the missionary battles and the gradual revival, Buddhism in Sri Lanka still faced an uphill struggle. By 1751, under the rule of King Kirtisri Rajasinghe, there was a dire shortage of ordained monks. In fact, there were no fully ordained monks left in Sri Lanka. It was then that King Kirtisri Rajasinghe, understanding the critical need to revive the Buddhist order, sent an embassy to Thailand. He appealed to the Thai king to send monks to Sri Lanka to ordain new Buddhist clergy. This decision sparked the beginning of a process that would lead to the restoration of the Buddhist Sangha in Sri Lanka. When the British took control of Sri Lanka in 1796, Buddhism faced yet another wave of challenges. The British were focused on expanding their empire and commercial interests, and their policy of suppressing local religions did not bode well for Buddhism. But despite the odds, Buddhism in Sri Lanka continued to endure. The turning point came when Sri Vikramarajasinghe, the last king of the Kingdom of Kandy, was defeated in 1815. With the fall of the Kingdom of Kandy, Sri Lanka was brought under British colonial rule. This marked the official end of more than 2,300 years of continuous Sinhalese rule on the island, dating back to the time of King Vijaya in 5th century BCE. But the story of Buddhism was far from over. After Sri Lanka gained its independence from British rule in 1948, a new chapter in the island's Buddhist history began. The revival movement gained significant momentum. The Sri Lankan government officially declared Buddhism the state religion under Article 9 of the Constitution. This recognition provided much-needed support for the Buddhist community. Today, Buddhism continues to thrive in Sri Lanka. It is the faith of 70% of the population, and the island is home to over 6,000 monasteries and more than 15,000 monks. Buddhism is not only the dominant religion but also a central part of the island's identity. The Mahavihara and other ancient monasteries continue to stand as pillars of Sri Lankan culture, and the nation's commitment to preserving its Buddhist heritage remains unwavering. The revival of Buddhism, from the struggles against foreign invaders to the battles with colonial forces, is a remarkable tale of resilience, faith, and survival. Today, Sri Lanka remains one of the leading centers of Theravada Buddhism in the world, carrying forward the sacred traditions passed down through the centuries.